Welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, where stories about the power of focus and resilience are revealed by the people who live those stories. And now, the host of the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, Jack Hopkins.
Hello and welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast. I'm your host, Jack Hopkins. And today I welcome back an investigative journalist that if there's anything Musk-Trump related you want to know, he's the guy. Dave Troy, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Jack. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Look, we are in crunch time, and I've been poring over everything you've written in the last couple of weeks. I always do, but the last couple of weeks I've found myself reading your post a second and third time. And I thought, I want to give, I know you've got multiple avenues of getting the word out, but I think your message is so critical, so important that I wanted to offer yet another so that there's no possibility of anybody not having access to it and hearing what you have to say. Because as I see you nodding in agreement, almost in anticipation of what I'm going to say next, it is important.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I think one of the things that we've seen, as this is all unfolded really over the last 10 years or so, people eventually get it, right?
Right.
But they get it a little bit too late. And, it's almost always, kind of this like, oh shit moment when it's like, a year or 6 months or 2 months after some terrible thing has unfolded and people go, oh, I see now what's in play. And so, what I've been doing really, for the last several years is trying to just do a little bit more homework, a little bit more reading to get better into the heads of, what amounts to our adversaries here. And, and when I say our adversaries, I'm not even really speaking so much of like our fellow Americans. I'm talking really about our foreign adversaries, Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. And, part of the problem of kind of getting into their headspace is that they have different language and, and different alphabets, different ways of seeing the world. And it's very, very difficult to get into the headspace of what our adversaries want to do and how they want to reshape America's role in the world. And, you have a lot of projection where people here in the States sort of think, well, if I was Russia, I would think this way because, and of course, if you've been raised in sort of a Western worldview and way of seeing things, you're not going to get that right.
No.
So, the people, I think, have an image of like Putin as being this like cold, calculating, rational strategist. But the fact of the matter is that he's kind of a mystic lunatic and a really good tactician. But he's a terrible strategist. And, but the one thing that he is super persistent. Super persistent. He will not let this go. And people think that he will just give up on this stuff. And he's not, because he set things up in a way where there's no way back. There's no way to go back to the way things were. The best we're going to get is some new situation where things are different, but maybe we can keep the devil down in the hole, as they say, as Tom Waits says. So, I think that's kind of the scenario that we're in. And so, what I'm saying is important because what's going to happen is that in a few months, people are going to go, oh shit, either Donald Trump is elected and this is way more terrible than anybody ever imagined, or he's not going to get elected, and they're still going to be doing some terrible things. So we can talk more about that. But that's really, my pitch to America right now is, wake up and smell the cat food, because we got a lot of stuff inbound that if we don't stop it, it's going to be really bad.
Right. And that's one thing I specifically, among other things, but that I wanted you to be able to convey to the listeners, to the viewers, is that we face a really uphill climb no matter how this election turns out.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not like they're going to stop coming if Kamala Harris is declared the winner and takes takes the White House seat.
Correct.
If anything, and this is your area of expertise, coming from a layperson perspective, they're just going to come harder.
Yeah, no, and it's, if you look at what the kind of moves that Musk's making right now, where he's just continually breaking the law and doing things that are kind of insane, he's set up a situation where, again, it's just like with Putin, he can't go back to the way things were because he's now, in jeopardy of all kinds of, repercussions from the stuff that he's doing. And, people can argue over which things are the most illegal, but he's communicating with Putin, he's paying people to vote, it's crazy stuff. And so he's banking very much on things going his way in the election and not facing any real accountability. But if Harris is elected, and God willing she is, because she's the only pathway out of this, if there is one, they're going to basically first, all the things that everybody's anticipating, election denial and lawsuits and potential violence. And, sure, things are different than they were in 2020 in many ways. I actually don't think that, like all of the election denial institutional stuff is the place that we should be most worried. To me, the thing that we should be most worried about is the debt ceiling situation that's coming up in the first part of next year. And the problem with that scenario is that it really requires that the Congress take action to, raise the debt ceiling yet again, or, the pro move would be to just, pass legislation that eliminates it, because it's probably not constitutional anyway, but it's there and it was put in place by legislation. It can be removed by legislation, but that's going to be really hard. But anyway, this debt ceiling situation is going to come up in early January. Really, the deadline is January 2nd, which is the day before the new Congress is sworn in. And then, of course, we know January 6th is going to be the day when the election is certified again. So, that time period is going to be very fraught, let's just say, with a lot of concern and attention. And unless the Democrats take control of the House, Mike Johnson's going to be the speaker, and maybe a miracle will occur and the Democrats will take the House. From what I hear, that's unlikely, but I don't really take any polls real seriously right now. So we'll see what happens on Tuesday or Wednesday. But at any rate, the debt ceiling situation is going to be such that if the deadline comes and we don't have legislation that addresses it, then what will happen is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen in this case, because she's going to still be Treasury Secretary no matter what on January 2nd, she will enact what's called extraordinary measures, which she had to last do in 2023. And what that will do is basically, it's just like when you prioritize which bills to pay in your household, right? Like if you're broke and you got to decide you're going to pay the electric bill and, buy groceries, but you might not, pay your magazine subscriptions or something.
Sure.
So anyway, that's going to kick in January 2nd. And you can get by a few months on that, usually not clear exactly how long, depending on what kind of scrimping and cost cutting they can do for a while. But basically what that means is that you got like a few months, maybe until April, May. I think last time they did this, they bought about 4 months. And so then there will be what's called the X date. And the X date is the moment when the U.S. stops paying its bills. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. And I think people are also very confused about what debt default actually means. We're not talking here about another government shutdown, although that would be a byproduct of this. We're talking about the U.S. not paying its bills at all. So not paying its debt obligations, not paying the military, not paying any federal employees. Nobody gets paid. And we're defaulting on the debt. So what that means is that, the U.S.'s credit rating would drop precipitously. And so all the ratings houses would, take our current, high rating and, cut. I think right now it's like AAA or I'm not super expert on bond ratings, but anyway, it's highly rated. People trust the U.S. government. And so if that rating falls, then our cost of borrowing goes way up. At which point, the current debt that we have, which is bad, like we should probably have less debt, although the debt as a proportion to GDP isn't that big of a deal. then our debt will cost way more. And so the whole thing will spiral out of control. The dollar will crash, stock market will crash, global economy will crash. And Moody's estimated it as a $15 trillion global hit. So if you think about the impact of like COVID, it was something like 3 to 4 trillion. This would be multiples of that. It would be the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off in the economy. And really, this is what Putin most wants. And Xi wants it too, because, they really want to take America down a peg and remove our hegemony in the world. And, while on the one hand, it would be messy and set off a whole chain reaction of events that nobody can predict. Putin in particular has such a chip on his shoulder about how, the Cold War ended and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that he's willing to basically burn everything down to see if, he gets a better hand of cards this time. Right. And he wants to do this in his lifetime. And we're here to watch it happen, And so if we don't want that to happen, we need to grow the fuck up, excuse my French.
No.
And, figure out at scale what is really at stake here and have people take actions that will prevent this from happening. And, one of the things that probably needs to happen is a decapitation attack in Russia, ultimately, to get this murderous regime under control, which nobody will talk about doing for reasons. Right. I get it. It's fraught. Right. But if we're really serious here, that dude needs to be gone somehow. And ideally at the hands of Russians who are getting fucked by him right now. So that's, sorry, that's about as angry as I'm going to get on this. But that's where things stand.
Let me ask you this, Dave, in terms, and I know I'm asking you to speculate here because none of us know for sure, but what's your gut tell you about how much the upper levels of our government have grown the fuck up and realize what the situation is and have the impetus to do something about it?
Well, if I'm being honest about it, I think that there are certainly individuals that get it, right? People have to at least have some sense of what's going on here. I think that the challenge that we face is that there's such institutional inertia to doing anything, you can know something all day long, but doing anything, and if so, what is kind of the challenge. So just to pick an example, what do you do exactly about Elon Musk? What are you going to do? Now, Pennsylvania the other day tried to have a hearing that he was supposed to show up at, and then he didn't. He filed a motion to move it out of Pennsylvania's jurisdiction into federal court. But, they didn't issue a bench, warrant for him because I guess they figured the legal filing was correct enough. But I think there's a lot of people that get what's going on, but just nobody really knows what to do. It's crazy. And it's not dissimilar from a 9/11 scenario where, Bush gets this memo that says, Al-Qaeda determined to attack in U.S., and they're like, well, that sounds bad. I guess that would be good if we did something about that. But then what exactly, And so, between the information that, all the intelligence community had, they pick up the guys. Do they know exactly where they are? And it just kind of turns out that it's nobody's job to worry about this. And, you look at Washington and sort of who populates Washington. And I think there's a lot of good people there. I'm not trying to put anybody down really, but it's kind of just the nature of the beast where you take somebody like Jake Sullivan, who, is a smart guy, Rhodes Scholar, well-educated, but he's, from the accounts that I've heard, kind of one of these Machiavellian career climber types. And these people generally kind of conflate their own career advancement with being good at what they do. So they kind of assume, well, hey, I'm the national security advisor. I must be really smart. That's a sign that I'm brilliant, and so whatever, ideas I have are therefore going to be the best ones. And, at the end of the day, I don't think he gets the Putin mindset or what they're up to really. And, you just see hints of it. And maybe I'm full of shit, I don't know. It's possible. It is quite likely that they have a lot of intel that I certainly don't have. On the other hand, I do spend a great deal of time digging stuff up and trying to read the stuff that they're reading and see things from their point of view. And, when Sullivan makes comments like, oh, let's have China's friends talk to China about curbing North Korea's actions. And I'm like, dude, you don't get what's going on with North Korea and China either of them. Like Putin has made a full-on pact with China to support their war effort, and you can raise questions as to how durable that is, but all the evidence that we have at this point is that it's quite durable. And then also, what people don't realize is that North Korea's missile program was largely, made possible in the last 10 years. You know how they went from not barely being able to shoot a rocket that did anything to being competent with rockets?
Yes.
The reason for that was because in the 2014 invasion of Donbass by Russia, they seized a whole bunch of rocket motors, Soviet-era rocket motors, and gave them to the North Koreans. So, there's a deep, long-standing alliance between North Korea and Russia, and people are just they're not aware of this, and so they're like, oh, well, North Korea's been brought into the war, and it's like, well, dude, no, they've been involved in this, tangentially for 10 years at least, So
right.
Anyway, I am skeptical that we have anybody that is either, the combination of knowing what's going on and in a position to do anything about it. It just doesn't seem to be happening.
This next question seems almost silly to ask it because so much of it is right in front of us and quite obvious. But would it be fair to say that the evil powers, if you will, have figured out that the way you deal with the United States is come together for all the differences you have? If the thing you have to do is remove the United States from the equation as a powerhouse, we have to at least unite for that. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I'd say that's right. There's a whole bunch of things kind of pointing in that direction where effectively what's going on is that you have the convergence of, two different groups around two different worldviews. And that set of worldviews is aligning globally. So you basically, you can call it, fascism and authoritarianism, autocracy versus democracy and open society. That would be the basic split. And so you see that across a lot of different writing around, all of this. You can look at Alexander Dugin, for example, who talks about, the catacon versus the eschaton and, dividing the world in two and really pushing the world to the brink at the end of, pointy end of a nuclear missile, basically, is the way to think of it. It's basically, putting the entire world into a situation where it's either, our side wins or you get nuked. That's the bargain that's on the table. And so, you see it in Dugin, you see it. There's another thing that I just recently became aware of called Project Russia. That was a set of books that became popular in Russia between 2007 and 2011. And, pretty well read there. And again, echoing the same kind of worldview of dividing the world in two. And it actually, there's a line in that work that says, this work will divide the world in two, and the side that wins is right. And so basically what you have is in these regimes that you mentioned, North Korea and Iran and China and Russia and, grab bag of others, is them aligning with this, authoritarian worldview. And this Project Russia document, which, I'll send you can include a link to it in your notes, but it basically outlines, a strategy for collapsing the global order, collapsing the dollar, crushing U.S. hegemony. It asserts that democracy does not work. It's failed. It's a decadent experiment that has gone wrong, and we should move away from it. And instead, the world should be run by a small handful of enlightened leaders, of which Putin is one. And
Sure.
I would argue that Musk is like the designee for the United States, or whatever will become of the United States. He kind of wants to be king of America, or at least a chunk of America that he can rule. And I believe that chunk will include Texas. Part, if I'm kind of implying the dissolution of the United States here, I am, it's very likely that the country would not survive this path, and we would end up in some kind of a scenario where, it would be some kind of a breakup scenario or a civil war of some kind. I'm not of the mind that we're going to end up with like a nationwide civil war where like everybody's at everybody's throats, because demographically we just don't have conflict fronts that would work that way. Like, I just don't see it,
Right.
But I do see the potential for like a Texas secession, which, Russia has been talking about for years, at least a decade. And, to be honest, like, Texas is probably the most vulnerable and most valuable state to kind of pick off and pull away from the United States. And again, probably somebody's listening to me going, oh my God, this guy's crazy. Texas isn't going to leave the United States. But, think through this critically. Like, the thing that would potentially start to happen here would be, let's say Harris wins. Let's say it's June 2025. Let's say the border is still perceived as a big problem. And so Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton of Texas, the attorney general there, they start ramping up their rhetoric further against the administration and saying, like, look, here's the deal. If you don't freaking deal with the border, we're going to secede. And of course, that would set off a huge firestorm, and it would very much help Putin. And of course, Musk would cheerlead that all day. And assuming Musk, isn't like in jail by then, but he probably wouldn't be. And so, then you'd have a scenario where all kinds of idiots would start going to Texas with their guns because they want to be part of the secession.
Sure.
You'd have people in Texas leaving Texas because they want to not be part of the secession and don't want to be part of this craziness. And I mean, Texas is like 47%, Democrat at this point. Like, it's not like there's no Democrats there. It's just majority Republican. And we'll see how that turns out really on Tuesday with Allred fighting Ted Cruz. But anyway, you'd end up with a scenario where you get this iterative effect that could then spark all sorts of unintended consequences. So then, let's suppose maybe Ron DeSantis gets in the act saying, well, if Texas is seceding, maybe we will too. And, maybe then Mississippi and Alabama get in the mix. And the next thing you know, you're recreating the, Confederacy or the Knights of the Golden Circle or, some godforsaken scheme. And of course, this is exactly what Russia wants. So again, I'm not suggesting that it's going to go this way. I'm not suggesting that even if it starts to go this way that they'll be successful, but I'm saying that just like with January 6th, which was unsuccessful, a lot of harm can come in the process, harm that we're still talking about and which cost several people their lives. So, we got to take this seriously as a security threat, ultimately, and we should be thinking about it in advance and gaming it out. And unfortunately, people are talking about Arnold Palmer's private parts instead. Right. And, that's interesting, but not really relevant. So
sure. When you think about or write about either one, not what we've seen, but what we have not seen from the FBI or the DOJ, how do you explain that in your mind as to why we've seen such quiet on those fronts regarding?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixture of factors, and probably there's some aspects of all of these things are relevant. But one is that doing investigations and building cases against people takes time. It takes expertise. It takes lots of resources that potentially are in not necessarily short supply, but they have to be prioritized. And to be frank, like I having had some experience looking into these things and occasionally working with folks in law enforcement to get information and whatnot. I think that there's a real, limitation in terms of depth of understanding of, resources. It's also, we have to consider people's constitutional rights. You can't just start monitoring people because they annoy you and,
Right.
saying speech is protected. We do have a First Amendment. So there's a lot of things that are sort of problem signs, but, that are protected by the Constitution. And unless people are directly interfacing with foreign nationals, that's protected activity. So, if we pretend to believe in the Constitution, then we also have to accept some of the limitations that come with that. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is we do have signs that there's been corruption at various times, and that becomes specific when you can see an indictment. So, we know about Charles McGonigal in New York, who was accepting money from Oleg Deripaska, I believe it was, and protecting some people from investigation, which was totally illegal and bad, and he was charged and sentenced, and that's good. But was he the only one? I kind of doubt it. Based on what I've seen, there's probably a network of people, and in fact, you can even make the argument that inside of any large bureaucratic organization, there are factions, and there's going to be factions that lean towards, progressivism and by the book, doing
Sure.
everything, to kind of protect the country. And there's other people that are going to turn a blind eye to what they perceive as, their political allies. And so, and again, you don't want to get in a situation where you're persecuting people for their political voting behavior. That's not great. And I think there's a lot of principled Republicans who, don't want any part of all of this craziness and just, have their opinions and just want to vote, and which is fine, not necessarily, you're not going to necessarily win with that, but, that's fine. It's your right to vote. I have no problem with that. So, at any rate, I think that it's just a combination of institutional inertia, a little bit of corruption, a little bit of just, being sympathetic to it, and a lot of lack of resources, lack of understanding. It's all
Yeah.
those things.
The big question mark for me personally, and I did not feel this way a year ago, so there have been things that have happened along the way that have nudged me this way. The big question mark for me is, how compromised is our military? What level of effectiveness have people like Flynn and the kooks that he surrounds himself with, who have made it clear that's one goal they've had going back a number of years? What are we looking at there potentially, do you think?
Well, I think there's been some studies on this, and I'm trying to remember. There's, I believe, a study that was done a couple of years ago that suggested that some percentage of the military, maybe 10%, was sort of radicalized in one way or another. And I might have that slightly wrong. People should go Google and find these reports. But and there's probably more recent studies too. But, there's a really good movie that was done recently called War Game, which you should be able to watch now on some of the streaming services. And not War Games, the Matthew Broderick movie with the computer and the nuclear missiles. This is War Game. It's a documentary about a simulation that was done on January 6, 2023, in anticipation of January 6, 2025. And it's basically sort of a tabletop exercise of simulating what would happen if a Michael Flynn type character led an insurrection using members of the military. And I think that they estimated that they would have a few percent buy-in from the military on that. And the story was that that the Flynn character was pitching to these military members was that they were the ones actually defending the real Constitution, and that the people
Right.
that had been elected were the usurpers, and were trying to take over the country on behalf of the CCP or whatever. So in that scenario, what they kind of found was like, oh, that'd be really bad, and they had all these sort of paramilitary groups that were trying to like take DC and whatnot. I think DC, in practice, in reality, this year, I think we're going to find that DC is pretty well locked down, because everybody kind of knows that, like, what might happen, and
Sure.
they're not going to have that happen again. And the other thing is that, Joe Biden is president this time and not Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was screwing with the Pentagon to try to make sure that there wasn't a response last time.
Yes.
So I think this is just qualitatively different than it was last time, but I do think that we might, could see problems at state capitals, as they seek to certify their own electors. And there's probably some stuff we haven't thought of that might turn up. But in terms of like radicalization in the military, I do think it's an issue. I don't think it's rampant to the point where like there's going to be a military coup kind of like no matter what. But I do think that there's enough people, not just in the military, but also in law enforcement, federally, locally, whatever. And also you have like this, all the militia movements and the constitutional sheriffs and all of that crap. All of that could merge and kind of come together to cause problems, particularly if there's a focus. And I think that's one of the issues that, we saw with January 6th was that, it brought all kinds of people together in one spot to kind of have a focused effect. Right now, I don't see where that focused effect would be. That's why I mentioned, state capitals might be an issue. But besides for Washington or the state capitals, what other physical places could you exert kinetic force to achieve any kind of strategic or tactical gain? And I don't, I haven't thought of a good answer to that yet. Maybe
Right.
your listeners have ideas and can email me.
And I'll state this. It's not that I've ever thought this one creates a legitimate strategic advantage. It just creates chaos, which may or may not create a strategic advantage.
Chaos can sometimes be helpful, yeah.
Right. A big concern of mine, just because it's still fresh on our minds from the COVID pandemic, is how much temporary interruptions in our supply chains, how much chaos and fear and panic that can create. And as you well know, when people are scared, when people are confused, when people are panicking, they are also more vulnerable to reaching out and grabbing the first thing that looks to offer security to them. So, that's been a concern of mine. And again, it's not like there's going to be, I don't think, like one leader who's unified with all the militia groups and all of the hate groups. So I think on that front, it will be more chaotic. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So perhaps this particular group thinks, hey, we'll hit the grid. Or,
right.
Hey, we'll hit the water supply. Again, not that that's any grand part of a scheme that works. But like you stated, as far as the people picking up arms and moving to Texas, there are just a lot of people who are just looking for an excuse to do some of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. People that are, sort of hobbyist, preppers, and people that think that they want to be the hero of some story. And, okay, fine, the thing about democracy and rule of law is that it's pretty boring. You go, you vote, you wait for stuff to happen, you have Congress, you pass laws, you pay your taxes. Like, that's not fun. But, if you had some kind of revolution or secession or battle or something, a lot of dudes are into that. I mean, and I think part of that is that, we are at a little bit of a deficit for meaning, in terms of our society. People are looking for things that give their lives meaning. And, this is something that people can sink their teeth into. It also feeds a lot of their social interactions. People are, a lot of the reason why people get involved with radicalization is for social reasons.
Right.
And to, feel belonging, to be part of a community, to get connected to others. And, that's crucial. That's innate to humans. So like we need to service that need in our society. In some ways, we're not doing a great job of that. So it's leading people down into these, radicalization pathways. As far as, whether we'll see, violence or not, or, supply chain disruptions. I mean, they've obviously been screwing around with truckers and whatnot in the past to try to see what kind of traction they can get. It doesn't feel like they've had very much luck getting focused, long-term participation from truckers. That whole idea got its start, or at least was well explored in Chile in 1973 as part of the, removing Allende and putting in Pinochet. And they found that was very effective. And of course, that was being run by the CIA, to basically disrupt the trucker supply chain, which of course, sparked a financial collapse, or helped spark a financial collapse. So I think, we could see some of that here. I mean, Lee Dundas in 2021 or 2 was talking about how they were actually planning a Christmas time, trucker disruption in order to create inflation, and disrupt the holiday season and post bad economic numbers for the fourth quarter and whatnot. So economic warfare is real. I think we should expect all the options to be brought to bear. And I also think we should be thinking a little bit more geopolitically about, what kind of global disruptions could disrupt our own perception of reality. So I just keep waiting for Putin and or, Kim Jong-un to do some kind of nuclear demo just to be like, hey, look, nuclear bombs, here you go. And of course, if anybody anywhere detonates a nuke, even if it's just over the ocean, there's going to be a huge global chatterfest about nuclear weapons, their future, the role in the world, America's capability, whatever. And that will alter public perception if that goes down. Likewise, there's a lot going on in space that people aren't thinking about. We've seen warnings about Russia potentially having, nukes in space of some kind. I'm even hearing chatter about ballistic stuff being put onto Starlink satellites, which isn't really public yet. But, if you think that, you might have some of those Starlink satellites in a position to explode, and I don't know whether we're talking about nuclear or, what is going on with that. I'm trying to learn more. But, any kind of disruption in space that could generate something like an EMP blast, which could take out a lot of terrestrial stuff, disable people's phones in over 100-mile, hundreds of mile radius. That could be financially and psychologically devastating. And we're just not thinking about that stuff because A, it's really unpleasant to think about, and B, it's probably somewhat unlikely. But, we need to be thinking about all these different kind of possibilities in terms of where this goes. Because as I said, the only way out for these guys is through. There's no way back. No. They have burned every bridge behind them, and they can't be held accountable at this point because they will be found guilty. There's too much going on, and it's likewise for Putin. He can't screw this up, or he's going to get removed by his own people. So we've got a lot of challenges ahead.
I've long had a saying, and it's something I've long said. It probably originated from somebody else, and I just picked it up. But there's never anything any more dangerous in my mind when it comes to human beings than someone who has, in their mind at least, nothing left to lose.
Right.
They just have nothing left to lose, and that's somebody who there are no boundaries left with that person. And, Dave, that's been one of the biggest eye-opening, shocking, disconcerting things for me the last few years, is when I look at how much of what we've seen happen really just came down to somebody willing not to do things the way we usually do them.
Mm-hmm.
It was like that was such a simple thing that we just assumed that, okay, this is how it's always done, so this is what the next person will do. But I'm not sure if anybody on any level had ever factored in, okay, but what if somebody doesn't?
Right.
Do we have any mechanisms in place to quickly and effectively deal with that? And in some cases, we've seen probably not.
No, and this has been the big strategic weakness in kind of our institutional setup in the United States is that, we, do have a constitution that guarantees people due process, and due process takes a lot of time. And, it takes 1 second to violate a norm. It takes 1 second to violate the law. And the consequences of that can be dire. And so, what we're kind of up against is with somebody like Musk, who, by any measure is a high agency individual. Like, you can't deny that, right? He's done a lot of things that a lot of people said are impossible, from everything from electric cars to, robots and rockets. And, there's just a lot of things that he's been attached to that are people have thought to be impossible. And, you can argue over how much credit he deserves for any of that. Arguably, he's building mostly on the work of others. But at root, he is a high agency individual. And I think part of what we're seeing here is that his agency has been further augmented by an assurance from his buddy Putin that he is unstoppable, and that not only unstoppable, but totally unaccountable, can do whatever he wants. And, a way to think about it is that he's backed by Putin's nuclear weapons, or the perception of Putin's nuclear weapons. Everybody likes to say, well, Putin's nuclear weapons are probably crap and poorly maintained or whatever. But I'm like, dude, all you need is one, right?
Sure.
You need one nuclear weapon that can reach, like London or Washington or Berlin or, wherever. And, you've created a sufficient nuclear deterrent. So, what you could end up with is a scenario, and this is kind of what I'm anticipating, is a scenario where Musk does things, is not stopped because we can't get our act together. And then if somebody really does decide that, they're going to come after him, Putin says, well, you can try that, but, London's going to get nuked. Do you really want to do that?
Right.
And, people can argue over whether that's a real threat and all the game theory aspects of, nuclear deterrence or whatever. But at the end of the day, if that's what the game is, and I do think that these guys, especially people like Musk, who is a big gamer, see this as all a big game. He's such a sociopath. He has no empathy for anybody.
Right.
And, he sees this as a giant game to be won. And he's also convinced himself that he's saving human civilization in the process by becoming a multiplanetary species. I'd love to know which dude in the FSB came up with that line to feed into his head, because now he will do literally anything, and he will be convinced that he's saving the freaking, human race.
Right.
So that's what we're up against, and people can kind of go, oh, it's not that, but really, it is that bad. It's this crazy. And, I believe that we will end up learning that lesson fairly soon.
Yes. What are your thoughts? And I think I know the answer, or the likely answer, just based on the concept of mutual destruction. So I know which way I'd lean on this, but I'm wondering if there's something I'm missing. What do you think the likelihood is that in the right situation that Putin does go ahead and launch a nuclear attack on London or on somewhere in the United States?
Yeah, I hesitate to give him, that much power to say that like he would do this, and because really, if you believe that he would do that, then you don't really have much choice but to kind of capitulate to his threats, because you don't want to kill, 16 million people or something.
Right.
But at the same time, like, I do think that they might do something just to prove the point that they're nuts. And I also think that it's possible, although maybe unlikely, that, these leaks that, Trump performed, with all these nuclear documents in his bathroom may have compromised our nuclear deterrent capability. And that's not unrealistic. That's entirely within the realm of the possible. And in fact, if as we do, that this is part of their goal is to, compromise America's, capabilities, that's something we should probably expect. And, the fact of the matter is that this is so secret that they can't even talk about what it was. So we don't know. In fact, the fact that we don't know means we should probably assume that that's maybe likely what was going on,
I agree.
So, to the extent that we don't have perfectly balanced, mutually assured destruction, that we don't have an informational advantage potentially over the adversary, we should assume that they may think that they can survive some kind of a first strike situation.
Right.
And maybe they really think that. Now, I think in practice, we've got plenty of good aerial reconnaissance and whatnot. And so if they start to move into the mode of, launching some kind of, high stakes attack, they're going to retreat into their bunkers and hide certain assets and do things that should be pretty obvious to us. So I think we can at least know if something's coming. I don't know what we'd do about it if we saw that, but at least we'd know,
Right.
It'd be good to have a few minutes to know, So, I think that's sort of where we're at. And again, that's why I think they have a lot more to gain by threatening things and doing things that seem menacing, and also potentially some kind of a demo thing, either of like a nuke or some, like an experimental weapon, blow up some island somewhere with nobody on it and be like, oh, look what we did to the island. And then everybody can write op-eds about it. That'd be great.
Sure.
So I think, that would be my guess as to kind of like what they would do before doing anything like, that would really attack a major city.
Yeah.
But they're also nuts, so we'll see. I don't know.
I lived in Guam for a couple of years in the 90s, and I still have friends there. And I know they are on kind of a heightened mental and emotional alert because, as you state, and now to be clear, you indicated island out in the middle of nowhere where nobody lives.
Right.
And I see that as being more likely as well. However, if you wanted to make a big statement but not touch the U.S. mainland and have a much greater chance of hitting it, Guam would be one of those targets that,
sure.
So
well, and there's also that other island. Is it Mauritius or no? It's not. It's another island that was just handed back over to Mauritius in the Pacific that has some military, nuclear type assets on it. U.S. Air Base there.
Yes.
So, it's like that kind of stuff. And so then you get, because ultimately, while we do have a deterrence posture and we want to, blow them up if they blow us up, do we really want to, though?
Right.
Do we really want to go down that path? And so I think what they would, and I think that particularly, and I hate to say this because it's just, so stereotypical, but, there you have Putin. You have a potentially female president who they have convinced themselves is an idiot. And, he's thinking, oh, a woman can't possibly manage this scenario. And so I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. And, it's impossible to overstate the degree to which these guys think that they are blessed by some kind of divine or mystic destiny. Like, these dudes are in some crazy belief systems. And, there's several that are overlapping. There's a little cult group called the Divievo cult, that is convinced that there's going to be a Holocaust, apocalypse scenario, and that only the people in the cult are going to survive. And these are Putin's buddies that he counts on for advice. Putin himself is believed to be a bit of a mystic believer and is super into all this kind of Altai, Mount Athos, mysticism and whatnot that, blesses the Russian people. They're also trying to bring about what's called the Third Rome, which is a Catholic prophecy that the Russian Orthodox and the Roman churches will merge and have their new headquarters in Moscow. And indeed, they built a cathedral dedicated to the Russian military to help bring this about. So people should not underestimate the degree to which they are motivated by weird mystical belief systems and prophecy. And it's, as I say, he's not a cold calculating, strategist or chess player. He's a lunatic mystic, and we should take that into account.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I've taught this in seminars often years ago, that when you hear people bring up, oh, I wish I could tell what this guy or this woman, I wish I knew what they were thinking. And my thing has always been, forget about what they are thinking and discover what they believe. Because if you can discover what they believe, then a great deal of the time you'll get pretty close to being able to tell
Correct.
what they are thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And A belief is the filter and the director of so many aspects of human behavior. And so, like you said, when you start getting kooky beliefs, you just about can't not have kooky behavior and
Correct.
Planning.
Yeah. Well, and there's, I heard a quote, and I'm forgetting now where I heard this. I need to figure it out because it's such a good line. But I read this somewhere recently that Russia is what you could call a high context society, where there's a lot of shared cultural context and stories and common knowledge that people have about how the world works, and so it's a very I would say kind of complete worldview that kind of comes with being Russian, and it makes you see the world in a very particular way, and that I'm sure has roots in Russia's geography, its relationship with the rest of Europe, and just generally its history. But when Americans and Westerners, but particularly Americans, try to understand that worldview, they look at all the individual, they look at their education, they look at their writings or whatever. But you really have to combine at least some rudimentary knowledge of this high context Russian thought and all of these other sort of belief systems that are running around in Russia, and put these people into that milieu. And I will be the last person to claim to be any kind of a Russianist or a Russian expert, but I am a diligent reader and researcher, and I have read a lot of stuff about Russian cosmism, Russian nationalism, and generally the Russian worldview, and I know enough about it to know that we're getting it wrong. And so I think, when people are evaluating Putin and what he will or won't do or what he's motivated by, they really need to get a handle on some of these mystic, contextual things that really come from Russian culture. And I'm not convinced that we've done a good job of that.
Right. And something that came to mind while you were talking about that, one example I used to give was, every now and then on National Geographic or some type of documentary, you will see one of these newly discovered Amazon tribes, for example, that have never had human contact before, right? And the one thing I know that you can count on prior to any kind of human contact, the level of miscommunication between the members of that tribe is about as close to zero as it can get, because they have all got the same shared reality, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have different geographical locations. You just, one word that they use to describe something will mean the same to everybody else. That's not true in our society.
Right. We have a big messy culture. Yeah.
Right. So when you come back then and look at the Russian culture, would it be fair to say that the Russian culture has more of a shared reality than the United States, the Western world?
Yeah, I'd probably defer to somebody that's like a real Russia specialist to make that statement, but I would certainly have that sense that, and you also have to consider Russia is big. Like, there's a lot of different cultures and ethnicities that are part of that whole milieu. And, you go to different parts of Russia, it's a totally different ethnic background. So, I think yes, but with limits. And I think also that, when we're talking about sort of official Russia, we're talking about people, from St. Petersburg, from Moscow, who have this kind of shared experience, and particularly for older people, they, remember the USSR and how that went down. So, they have a lot of that shared context. And I think that's kind of a lot of what we're dealing with. And I think with Putin, you really have to consider the KGB and his experience with the KGB and just, Chekist thought in general, and that stuff goes back, all the way back to the secret police of the Tsars and stuff, and probably way before that. Other historians can weigh in on that, but it's it has deep roots, and I think that the deal with Putin is that he is basically extending the work of the KGB from like immediate post-war era, and sure, they were doing a lot of this kind of stuff prior to the war, but really, and it's fascinating to me. I'm trying to write, a book about this set of topics. And what I've been finding is that the candidacy of Henry Wallace in 1948 is basically the exact same as Trump's. It's, rapprochement with Russia, peace, reduce nuclear arms, reduce arms spending, reduce the military, and everybody's happily ever after. And the thing about, the Russian view on peace is they use the word mir, which means both peace and world. And so the phrase Ruski mir means literally Russian peace, but it also means the Russian world. And some people take it to mean like the Russian worldview. But in this great paper that I read about reflexive control, which is a mechanism of Russian projection of power, it basically said that, when Russians demand peace and say, we in Russian they had this laid out, we demand Ruski mir, we want the world, basically, is another way to translate we want peace. And
Sure.
So all of these kind of peace movement things that took place in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were really Russian projections of power trying to disarm the United States so that Russia could, use information warfare to sort of advance its own causes as much as it wanted to without any deterrence. And I think you have to look at that through like the KGB lens, not the communist ideological lens. Because ultimately what happened was the communist ideological lens collapsed, but the KGB's power and its ability to project power grew. And now that's what we're dealing with Putin.
That's a fascinating, what you just said. I think, I know it is for me, and if anybody listening or watching, if they just get that, what you just said, I'm going to ask you to expand on it a little bit. But that connection, if we look at let's look at the 60s, for example, mid to late 60s up to early 70s. And I wanted to know if I'm on track with this, that much of what we saw going on within our culture, to include the hippie culture and peace is love, that kind of thing, could very well have been, or maybe was, the result of a well-crafted KGB campaign to disarm and kind of take the fight out of America.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well supported by evidence at this point. Now, that being said, there's a lot of stuff that needed to be fixed in America in the 60s. We had segregation and, all kinds of racial discrimination and Jim Crow and just generally sucking. We sucked pretty hard and we needed to fix that. So what was happening was the Soviets, were basically looking at all of our problems and our fissures and divides and everything and going, you guys aren't very good on civil rights, so we're going to make a big stink about that and cause a lot of trouble inside the country. And of course, you had a lot of very principled people who were like, well, actually, yeah, we do suck on civil rights and we do need to have a Civil Rights Act and, we really should fix, segregation and all that. So, that kind of stuff actually, probably advanced social equality and justice in the United States. And to some extent, thanks, Soviet Union, you helped us out on that. But at the same time, you have to look at it from just the lens of like, that advanced their cause as well, because it, to be really frank, you can draw a straight line from KGB efforts into like the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg, which led to, Cy Hirsch and, My Lai and the Family Jewels and Church Committee. And, honestly, Church Committee reforms really needed to happen, to be sure. But if you look at kind of like what we kind of lurched too far back in the other direction afterwards, because what ended up happening, and I can tell you this because I've done like 1,100 FOIA requests with the FBI at this point, spanning decades. And what I can tell you is that we basically stopped doing counterintelligence after like 1976. And, you have Stansfield Turner fired like 820 people at the CIA. He pissed off John Singlaub, who ended up being a mentor to Mike Flynn, because he recalled Singlaub from Korea in 1977 or 8. And, so a lot of the seeds that were planted for everything that's going on now were really the product of the KGB's desires in the late 60s, early 70s to, kind of point out America's hypocrisy, to tear us apart from the inside. And, nobody can rightly defend MK Ultra, which was real,
Sure.
or, the FBI breaking into things. There's just a lot of stuff that was done that was overreach. And but the thing was that the KGB was watching closely what we were up to, CIA and FBI, and anytime there was any dirty laundry, they would pass it over to journalists, like Seymour Hersh or anybody else that, was trying to expose this stuff. And so it ended up that there was kind of this pipeline of KGB intelligence going out through journalists, people like Bob Perry, I.F. Stone, and a lot of people will defend Cy Hersh and Bob Perry and I.F. Stone till the end because, they were principal journalists, but they were also getting help from the KGB. And so, and then you get into these long arguments about who was guilty and, should we blame, it doesn't really matter. Dude, this is a sausage grinding machine and it makes sausage. This is how it works. You don't have to get into blaming anybody. It's just what's going on, Yeah. So, it's complicated. It's endlessly fascinating milieu in which to look, especially now, kind of after the fact. My personal opinion as a proud Gen Xer is that the boomers kind of got their own identity wrapped around the axle on some of this stuff. I don't think that a lot of them saw clearly the interaction between the KGB and the press and, what it was doing to our intelligence capacity. And that really led to the kind of lurch in the other direction where that now has made it possible for people like Trump and Musk to not be held accountable because we blew out too many walls in the 70s trying to be, less repressive, So anyway, it's complicated. Lots of good people on both sides, the usual, but it's a bit of a mess now.
What are your thoughts on the cryptic message from Trump to Speaker of the House Mike Johnson about our little secret?
Our little secret. Yeah, it's hard to know what they were meaning by that. I think a lot of people have taken that to mean that there's going to be some kind of, electoral college shenanigans, or maybe they'll throw the vote to the House and, try to have some kind of state-based vote. There's all these little Baroque mechanisms that people are identifying that could potentially be brought to bear. Who knows? I think it would be stupid for Trump to advertise that kind of a strategy through that kind of a, little offhand comment. I thought it was a weird thing for him to do. And to the point where that would be such a weird thing to do that I don't necessarily think that's what he's talking about. I think he might be talking about, they have some kind of plan to hold on to the House or gain more seats, or they're thinking
Sure.
about whatever the election totals might be for different House seats or whatever. The other thing that he could be referencing is something to do with the debt ceiling coming up next year. So it might be something related to that. But I think the bottom line is it was probably a throwaway remark that has been overanalyzed by people because they're looking for certain things. But who knows?
Sure.
I just don't know, and we'll see. Soon, it's a couple months probably. What that means.
So, as a last word from Dave Troy to the people of this country, and not so much on voting. I'm of the mind at this point there aren't really any undecideds. There might be a few stragglers here and there, but for the most part, everybody knows who they're voting for or if they're going to vote.
Right.
But what would you say to the American public, particularly those of us who love democracy and want to defend democracy? What's the proper mindset to enter into post-election for either scenario? What should we be prepared mentally and emotionally to come to grips with?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, obviously, the stakes are super high. I think a Harris win is necessary, but not sufficient to kind of get us towards where we can breathe again. To the extent that, if Trump is elected, I think we're just going to have to work really hard to wake up folks on the other side to the threat that's posed. Because really, I have some empathy for people that are being sucked into this, where they think they're voting for Donald Trump and his brash ways and his willingness to stand up to the other side or whatever, but they're not. They're voting for a short man over in Moscow with his little sidekick Elon and Peter Thiel and JD Vance and that crew. And so they're being misled. They're being sold a bill of goods. I feel bad being patriarchal about it, or sort of being you poor people have no idea what's actually happening, but it's kind of true. And I do feel for some of them. I listen to C-SPAN every morning, people calling in, and they got their crazy ideas that they got from who knows where, and you feel bad for some of them. It's just they're just ill-informed. So right. Without being too patronizing, I think that that's a reality. And I think so one thing we should consider doing is, if, God help us, Trump wins, we need to take on kind of a campaign of education of turning people on that side against this administration and demanding that we restore that we retain and strengthen our institutions. Because the only thing that will keep us from total oblivion here is strengthening our institutions. Just as we saw kind of the never Trumpers and various people on the right have turned against Donald Trump over the years, I think we'll see a bigger wave of that now if Trump wins, particularly if they realize that they've really sold themselves out to Musk and Putin. I think that's probably a practical approach there. And then, if Harris wins, then we need to turn our attention to dealing with other systemic threats, some of which Harris herself doesn't, I think, see yet. The debt ceiling is probably on her radar, but again, I'm not hearing anything about that from her or from Biden. So I think we need to get Biden immediately to start talking about that from the bully pulpit, because it's existential, and that will be the attack surface that people like Musk turn to immediately. And Mike Johnson, same thing. So that needs attention. We also need to bring crypto risk to bear. And what's going on with crypto is that assets like Bitcoin are inflating in value so much that it's capturing the political system, and it's capturing politicians on both sides. So we have, in this cycle, over $200 million has been spent by crypto interests to capture politicians on both sides. And the goal of that capture, of course, is to make crypto assets go up in value even further, because they would, presumably restrict regulations that would otherwise hinder crypto's progress. If the price of crypto doubles, then the amount of government capture is going to double, to the point where if it goes up to where Bitcoin is $1 million or something, then you're going to have this whole class of people that got into that stuff early that are able to drive, go around and drive Lamborghinis at the expense really of everybody else, because everybody else's purchasing power will decline proportionally. So it's a zero-sum game, and the European Central Bank just put out a really good paper on this that describes the dynamics of what might happen here. And not only would you have potentially, depletion of people's savings and buying power, you'd also potentially, in the scenario where it crashes or, regulation is suddenly placed, you'd have potential for real civil unrest, because the main people that are into the crypto stuff are young men. And they are young men that have been steeped in kind of anti-Semitic, anti-bank, anti-government ideology for the last few years, and they're highly networked. That's a recipe for genocide, honestly.
It is.
If those people are suddenly unemployed with no other skills, and they're angry and they have a scapegoat, that is going to be terrible. So, we have that to deal with. Again, I think, try to expect the best, be prepared for what may come. We'll see how things go. But again, people shouldn't have the idea, like somebody the other day online was like, I was, suggesting an agenda for Biden and Harris to follow because we really do need to pay attention to these risks. And somebody was like, "Oh, you shouldn't tell Harris what to do. Let her cook." I'm like, "Okay, well, dude, you are she is more than entitled to cook. Please, by all means, cook. But here's some things you need to have on your radar. Really,
Right.
I'm not joking around here, and I'm not waiting for you to figure this out on your own. I'm going to send you a memo." And everybody else should too. And you do that with love. You do it not to second guess people. You do it because you give a damn, and people should give a damn. So
I said the same yesterday on a podcast with Jonathan Greenberg. I said, my feeling is if we get Kamala elected and get her put in place, that one of the first things we do, and as you said, respectfully, is start applying public pressure on her to do these things like you are talking about.
Yep.
Because we don't have the comfort of time on many of
this
them.
can't wait. If we let crypto interests capture, our entire political system, then we're done. And I think, she's a quick study. She can quickly figure that out.
Sure.
But ultimately, we have to take a stand on some of these things. And that's what, the Project Russia thing. We're dividing the world in two. Crypto is on the bad side of this divide, unfortunately. It cannot exist unregulated and not kill our entire democracy. It's just the way it is.
Is crypto, in your mind, the potential Trojan horse?
It's one of them. Yeah, it's definitely one of them. And I think there's several. You've got Trump now as a kind of Trojan horse. You've got Elon's capture of the space program as another. Crypto. There's just a bunch of them that if they don't get curbed, we're going to have big problems. So.
All right, Dave. Well, listen, I always get excited about having you on. You are one of a handful of people out there whose every word I hang on, because I know that if you write it, you've researched it to the fullest extent. So thank you for coming on. Look, I know you're busy, you've got other things to do, so I truly appreciate you making time for me and my viewers and listeners, and let's hope for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on. It's helpful to kind of expand the reach of the message at this point. And if folks want to talk about this or have leads on stuff that's going on, I'm available on X at Dave Troy, although we'll see if I stick around there after the election.
Right.
They've squashed reach quite a bit in the last few days. And then also I'm on Signal at davetroy.69, which is assigned randomly. So. and
you may have just stated that you've got a website as well.
Yeah, davetroy.com. It has links to a bunch of my stuff, and you can follow me there. So.
Perfect. All right, Dave. Thank you again, and talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Jack. Let's hope things go well next week.